For United States history so far, we have read about Native Americans who were the first and used to be the only people living in North America. Then we read about pilgrims sailing from England to the east coast of the United States. They made colonies and then they decided they wanted their own country and they didn't want to be ruled by the King of England anymore. So there was a war called the American Revolution. Remember, we read about Paul Revere. America won the war, and so we became our own country, the United States. Then people called pioneers started walking west with their wagons and exploring. Then we read about the gold rush, which brought hundreds of thousands of people from all over the world using different routes. They came to California to try to find gold. And now we're going to read about a man named Abraham Lincoln, who I'm sure you've heard of. He's on the penny. And we are going to read about his life and how he became president and the important events that happened while he was president. This is a very good but very long book, so we will take 3 days to read it. Abraham Lincoln by Ingrid and Edgar Perrin Dallaire. Deep in the wilderness, down in Kentucky, there stood a cabin built of roughly hewn logs. It was a poor little cabin of only one room. The February wind tore at the clumsy door and made it rattle on its leather hinges. Just a glimmer of daylight sifted in through the oiled deer hide stretched across the single window frame. But the flames flickered on the hearth. In this cabin lived a man named Thomas Lincoln with his wife and his little daughter Sally. And here it was that his son, Abraham Lincoln, first saw the world on a Sunday morning. It wasn't much of a house in which he was born, but it was just as good as most people had in Kentucky in 1809. "Abe is solemn," said the kinfolk who came to see him. "He grows so fast I can't keep him in shirts," said his father. His mother spun and sewed. Just as fast as he outgrew the old ones, she had new little shirts ready for him, and she played with him and watched him grow while the father was busy tilling the fields. Often she took Abe to a spring nearby and sat there in the shade, singing little songs to him. But the soil on the farm was meager. That means it wasn't very good, and the father grew tired of toiling with it. "I reckon we'll be moving," he said, and he bought a farm on Knob Creek on the other side of the hill. There, Abe learned to help on the farm, even before he had his first pair of pants. He held the tools and he sat on the horse, and so Abe and his father and the horse plowed the fields together. And when planting time came, his father strode in front, and Abe toddled behind him, dropping seeds. One day the father shot a buck in the woods, that's a male deer, and from the skin the mother made Abe a pair of breeches, those are pants. Abe stood beside her watching every stitch she sewed. He felt very proud. Little children ran about in shirts and petticoats only, but now he would be a big boy in breeches. And Abe put on his buckskin breeches, washed his face and hands in the brook, and went off to school with his sister Sally. The road to school was 2 miles long. On the way they met other children who came trotting down from the hills, all about to the schoolhouse in the valley. There they sat together, big and small, reading and writing and reckoning aloud, all at one time together. There was such a chatter that it could be heard a long way off. But when Abe was 6 years old, he had learned both to read and write. After that, he didn't go to school much. Abe lived down in the valley, and up on the hill lived a boy he played with often. Between the valley and the hill ran a brook, and across the brook there lay a log. The boys had to run over that log to get together to play. One day it had rained so hard that the brook ran fast, and the log across it was slippery. With a big splash, Abe fell head first into the water. If his friend hadn't come running and fished him out with a pole, he would have drowned. Abe's father didn't like to have neighbors too close by. "It is time to move when you see the smoke of your neighbor's chimney," he had said one day when Abe was 7. "I reckon we'll be moving." This time they traveled far, more than 100 miles. They rode and they walked and they ferried until they left Kentucky and came to Indiana, the new state. There they borrowed a wagon and traveled on, right into the wilderness. The roads became narrower and rougher, the forest darker and denser. At last they stopped in the midst of the woods at a place called Little Pigeon Creek. "Here we'll build our new home," said Abe's father. So here is Kentucky, where Abraham Lincoln was born, and this is Indiana, where his family moved to. While they were chopping down trees and building a shelter, the autumn sky and golden leaves were their roof. The shelter they built had only 3 walls with an open hearth where the 4th wall should have been. Day and night they had to keep the fire burning. In a corner they put up a bed for the parents. On the ground they spread bearskins over piles of dried leaves for Abe and Sally to sleep on. Then they unpacked the pots and pans and household goods and settled down for the winter. And where Abe and his father had cut down the timber, they plowed and planted between the tree stumps. That winter was long, but at last spring was there. Then the distant neighbors came to help them build a real cabin. It had 4 walls, but no window or door. They had to climb through a hole in the wall to get in and out. Up under the roof there was a loft where Abe was to sleep. Slowly the wilderness changed into a homestead. Often Abe and his family had only corn and potatoes to eat, but when hunting was good, the father brought game from the woods, and Abe and Sally found berries and honey. And once in a long while, the mother baked gingerbread. One day his mother gave Abe 3 gingerbread men all at once. He ran out under a tree to eat them slowly, all by himself. But hardly had he nibbled at the first one when a little boy spotted him. "Abe, give me a man," the little boy said. Abe gave him the larger one. The boy crammed the whole gingerbread into his mouth, and before he had swallowed it, he said, "Abe, give me the other." And Abe gave him the other one too, for he didn't know how to say no. "You seem to like gingerbread men," was all he said. "Abe," said the little boy, "nobody ever loved gingerbread as much as I do, and get so little of it." Slowly, Abe ate his one gingerbread man and wondered why the things he liked best were always the hardest to get. Can you imagine how disappointed and maybe frustrated Abe felt? He wanted to read and study, but school was far away and he had to stay home to help on the farm. The hard work made him big and husky, and he could outrun and outwrestle all the other boys his age. Even quicker than his legs ran his wit, that's his mind. So he became leader of all the boys who lived around Little Pigeon Creek. Abe hadn't much time to play, but sometimes at night he and his friends stole out to a salt lick in the woods. There they hid behind trees and watched the shy deer licking the salty slabs. But Abe never went hunting as the other boys and menfolk did. He loved the animals and wouldn't harm them. For 2 happy years, Abe and his family lived in their home in the woods near wolves and grumbling bears. But when he was 9, a dangerous sickness came to the wilderness, and his mother got sick and died. Then the woods seemed gloomy and dark, and the days grew long for Sally and Abe. How sad. A year later, their father went off on a trip, and for many weeks, Abe and Sally were left all alone. Then one day, a big wagon drawn by 4 horses stopped in front of their cabin. Out of the wagon jumped their father and a kind, rosy-cheeked woman. She ran over to Abe and Sally and hugged them. She had come to be their new mother. The stepmother had brought her 3 children and all her household goods. They unloaded a chest, a table, chairs, and feather beds, pots and knives and forks and spoons. So smooth and fine was the furniture that Abe could run his hands over it without getting splinters in his fingers, and the stepmother climbed up to the loft where Abe slept. She threw out the leaves that had been his bedding and gave him a soft feather bed instead. Then she put the father to work to make a real door, a window, and a wooden floor for the cabin. She washed and scrubbed the cabin both high and low and took charge of the family right away. "Let Abe have time to read," she said when she saw how eager to learn he was. At night, after the others had gone to sleep, she let him lie by the fireplace and study. In the flickering light, he practiced writing and reading. He wrote with charcoal on a wooden shovel and read the Bible, stories about George Washington, Pilgrim's Progress, and every other book he could get. Books were scarce in the wilderness. That means there weren't very many. But Abe didn't mind walking 20 miles to borrow one. When Abe grew too tired to read anymore, he climbed up the pegs in the wall to his loft. Before going to sleep, he hid the book he had been reading in a crack in the roof to keep it safe. But once a storm came up in the night, and when Abe woke up, his book was soaking wet and spoiled. He had borrowed this book from a rich farmer, and for 3 long days, Abe had to husk corn to pay for it. "No one can beat Abe Lincoln at farm work," said the neighbors. It was known for miles around how quick he was at splitting logs into fence rails. But when someone passed by, he would sit on the fence he had made and talk, asking questions to learn new things. Then the neighbors thought he was lazy, and when he walked between the handles of the plow reading a book, they thought he was strange.